that they agree to be recorded. No, the faces will not be recorded, but the session will be recorded. So, okay. So let's start. Yeah. The first person that is saying hello is the director of the SILAS, Professor Dr. Miriam Leigh-Brander. She is not currently here with us. And my task today is to welcome you and to moderate the session. But I encourage you to say hello and to know where are you now. Okay, so let's start. Thank you for your presence here. Thank you for joining us, especially to the Professor Francisco Rodriguez from the University of Extremadura. He has arrived yesterday. We're going to hear from Daniel Hernandez, the presentation of his biographical and career profile. I want to thanks in the name of the SILAS, your presence, the people that are here with us, the person that are online. This is the second event, our winter lecture series. And I would like to, of course, express my gratitude to the person that are supporting this winter lecture series, especially Professor Andres Jimenez and his students and colleagues in the Universidad del Rosario. Daniel Hernandez, he's a doctoral researcher here in Eichstätt, in the Catholic University of Eichstätt, Ingolstadt. He is a great supporter, helping us with the advertisement of the events of this lecture series, and of course, thank you, Professor Miriam Leigh-Brander, Professor Thomas Fischer, for all your work in preparing this winter lecture series. So we're going to hear or start by hearing the biographical introduction. Then we're going to hear the presentation that is entitled Reassessment of Cultural Cold War in Latin America, All Questions, New Sources. And after the presentation of Professor Rodriguez, we're going to have time for Q&A, a session for Q&A. And yeah, Daniel, please present Professor Francisco Rodriguez. Let me do something. I had to change now the, let me ask Andres, everything is okay? Are you hearing us well?
We're hearing you, seeing you perfectly.
Starting.
Yes, it's working. Do you hear me?
Andres?
It's working. ¿Puedes quieres aquí? ¿Acá? Okay.
Good.
Hi, Luis. It's working. We're hearing, we're seeing everything.
Can you hear me, Andres?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, thank you, Luis. Good evening, everyone, and good afternoon to our audience in Latin America. As Luis was saying, we welcome you to the second session of our winter lecture series. After a successful inaugural lecture by Professor Henry Feldmaya in the hybrid format of this series, we are pleased to welcome Professor Francisco Rodriguez, whom I will have the opportunity to introduce shortly. You will have approximately 50 minutes for your presentation, followed by a Q&A section. And then we can gather rounds of 3 or 4 questions at a time. So I will proceed to introduce Professor Francisco Rodriguez Jimenez, who is professor at the University of Extremadura and co-director of the Global Studies think tank at the University of Salamanca. He has recently been a visiting scholar at the Georgetown Americas Institute and at the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Lisbon for 2023 to 24. Previously, he held postdoctoral research position at Harvard, George Washington, and American University, and has been a visiting scholar at Wake Forest University, the Università di Bergamo, and Johns Hopkins University Bologna. He has been writing for Americracia, a blog for the newspaper El Mundo since 2017, and has collaborated with other international media outlets such as the podcast in Spanish from the Washington Post and the Latin American channel NTN 24. Among his most recent publications are the books El Americano Imposible, Estados Unidos y América Latina entre la modernización y la contrainsurgencia, published in 2023 by Silex, co-edited with Lorenzo Delgado and Benedetta Calandra, and U.S. Public Diplomacy Strategies in Latin America during the 60s, Time for Persuasion, publishing 2024 by Routledge and edited with the same colleagues. His lecture today is titled Reassessment of the Cultural Cold War in Latin America, Old Questions, New Sources. So thank you very much for being here, Francisco. The floor is yours.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Danke. My apologies that
Are you sure you are sharing the screen?
yes, I think so, no? Oh, here, right?
Yes. This one.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, seeing. Sure. Are you seeing the presentation? Andres? I guess so. Okay, yes.
Okay. Well, as I said, my apologies that I don't speak German, so I'll try to convey this talk presentation in English, or in the QA we can also talk in Spanish, Portuguese, or Italian, but I don't speak German, so my apologies. First of all, thank you very much to Silas, to Luis, and to Daniel for this kind of offer. Yesterday, I enjoyed a very warm weather in Munich, which is the first time I had such a luxury in Germany. I have been invited to Berlin a couple of times. It was always in winter, January and February, so I had very cold impression of Germany. Yesterday was perfect. Well, the title of the talk implies that I have been working on these topics since actually when I started my PhD dissertation in 2004. Regrettably, it's like 20 years, regrettably in the sense that I'm becoming old. So I try to revisit some of the questions I started to analyze 2024 when I first entered in the PhD program at the University of Salamanca. Why this is not good? Here, right?
Yes, or is this for?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, since I wanted to have this kind of ice-breaking question, so before starting my talk, I want to has the different backgrounds and learning process and levels of understanding of the Cold War. Why so? Because we are also part of Cold War, or at least our families, our grandfathers were part of this cultural context, ideological context. So the first question is, how many of you in the floor or abroad in Colombia can recognize these authors by name and perhaps title of their works? Any volunteer? Just to have this kind of survey, because the following slide is related with this, and depending what you answer in this first slide, I will try to trace some conclusion with the second slide answer. Anyone?
Well, I put the time in Russian, so this is not. Yeah.
Okay. Then for this survey, we will, if you don't mind, omit your answer. So those are the big names of Soviet studies or Russian studies, like starting with Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Tchaikovsky, right? So when I first asked this question, people, depending on their background, they are more knowledgeable or less knowledgeable about it, right? What about these other guys? Those are American authors. I don't know if you can mention some, but usually, especially if I present this conference in Spain or in France or in Italy or in Lisbon, where I live, most of the people are more knowledgeable about these American studies or American authors because they have studied then in either high school or the first university level. So why this is related to our talk? Because the Cold War was beyond the military competition. It was also competition to prove to the rest of the world, to the rest of the audience, that yes, we have very good authors, very good philosophers, poetries, historians, and so on and so forth. Continuing with this kind of test about your knowledge about cultural Cold War, I want to play this very quick video and ask if you have heard this song, these cartoons before. So, how many of you have heard about these very catchy songs and lyrics before? Any other? Well, to be honest, this was part of my immersion in Cold War studies because I had no idea, to be honest, about this cartoon until relatively recently. And it was I was friends with many people from Eastern Europe or ex-Soviet space republic, and they taught me about this because I was raised up in other cartoons that we will see later on, right? So this is the so-called Cheburaska cartoons, very popular in the Soviet space and totally unknown in the other side of the world. At least that was my Spanish case, my Spanish upbringing, never heard about until I was 35, 36 years old. My friends from Georgia, Romania, Lesbian, Estonia, they all knew about this cartoon because they were part of this, upbringing in a different cultural space. Well, this is of course a recreation, a meme kind of, and permit me the irony of this, but this related with this, again, cultural, ideological Cold War beyond the military context. Well, if I ask you about this, being in Germany, probably most of you will be more knowledgeable than the others. So is this kind of popular culture versus high culture contest. Why so? Because one of the first stereotype that US diplomats in Europe, not only in Germany, in Italy, Spain, they detected, they gathered, survey was that many Europeans thought, well, yes, Americans are very strong in military terms, economic terms, but they have no history, they have not literature, they have no philosophy at all, of course. And at the same time, American popular culture was starting to pour European cinemas, European theater. So there was this kind of context in between high culture and popular culture. We can develop this debate. I'm trying to be now brief, so we have more time for question and answer. So the classic narrative of Cold War has been context has been updated in these 20 years. When I started my PhD dissertation, there were very few work from this cultural Cold War perspective. Why so? Because most of the historians are starting to analyze, yes, military capabilities, economic power, and those hard power angles of this Cold War. Later on, some other authors started to say, well, of course, the military part of the Cold War was important, was vital, probably the most important. But at the same time, there are other layers, the cultural and ideological layer that are important and we shouldn't neglect if we want to have a kind of overall view of this conflict, because it was, again, beyond the military conflict. For instance, this is one of the most important, I would say, even turning points in this so-called cultural Cold War. I don't know if any of you know these scenes. This is July 1959, and it's the so-called kitchen debate in between Khrushchev and Nixon. To understand, I want to always, in my conference or my class, I want the audience or the students to think about how historical actor react in different situations. In this case, Nixon, that was a vitriolic and very angry man, was very furious with Khrushchev, discussing which model could provide a better house, a better kitchen for women, a better life. Of course, Khrushchev said that, well, we have better cuisine, better culture, better welfare state for our women, our people. And Nixon said, no, we do have better. Again, and I love this sentence, in war and love, timing is very important, right? This was precisely 5 months after Castro raised power in Cuba. So again, US, Washington, and Nixon was kind of nervous. Why so? Because very close to Florida, a leader, very famous and popular leader, had defeated a dictatorship that was very inclined to US foreign policy. In the middle of this geopolitical crisis, during the World Fair exhibition in Moscow, there was this called kitchen debate as another example of this Cold War in other realms, ideological or cultural realms. The competition, the context also implies sport and, of course, the aerial space career. In this case, we can see the famous dog Laika or the famous Soviet astronaut Yuri Gagarin being the first man on this competition to reach the moon or to prove that you have the capability, the technological capabilities for such a risky mission. Well, to try to offer also another angle perspective, how I don't want to explain all the detail, but how this competition also was very present during the Olympic Games, and the two blocks competed to win more medals, more victories during the Olympic Games, because the Olympic Games was the most famous sport vein of the war, right? Now, perhaps now soccer has replaced Olympic Games, but during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Olympic Games was the most important event, and all the countries needed or wanted to play better because it was this kind of competition. Music, of course, was also another realm of this competition. In this case, we will see later on some quotation for archive to see how Europeans, many Europeans, also many Soviets, perceive American jazz music or American rock music as like, well, this is popular music. This is not, of course, comparable with German music, German classic music, with the famous and big names of our history. As a result, US diplomacy tried to promote this new jazz music or new jazz American author. In this case, one of the most famous American jazz singer, or below Armstrong in Egypt, as part of this music diplomacy or music tour promoted by US diplomacy. Well, now with the question of the presentation. This co-colonization and the Cold War, the cultural mission of the United States in Austria, that was probably the first book I read when I started my PhD in 2004. I'm still puzzled with Walnater, I don't know how you pronounce Walnater, 1994. So it's a book that has already 30 years. And I'm fascinated because, well, for this talk, I revisited some of my notes I took 20 years ago, because I think this author posted some questions that are still valid. Like, for instance, can cultural imperialism and cultural hegemony work like a boomerang? In other words, we are talking about cultural transfer, cultural products. We tend to think that this is like big country projecting their culture to another country that accept or admit that. That is a kind of too basic understanding. There is not this black and white perspective, because most of the time there were contexts and rejections and hybrid products. So what one later, I think, wisely explained is that we should avoid this black and white narrative, because reality is much more complex, and there are many colors in between black and white, many gray. Or as for the jazz, as I said before, many Europeans had the prejudice, the stereotype that jazz was a literary nigger culture or black culture, and therefore they rejected. They was perceived as a, well, no high quality product. Or another important factor for this US public diplomacy strategy now is not as important, but during the 50s, there was a kind of context also in between British and American accent. Why so? Because Great Britain didn't want to lose their kind of area of our English is better than American English. So inside of the Cultural Cold War, sometimes you perceive this competition in between London and Washington for this realm of influence. So it's not only Soviet versus American context, but also British and American context. Also visiting some of those other big names, big books that I learned from, 96, 97, the famous also Richard Cusel, Seducing the French. That is another magnificent masterpiece, I would say. I served my own research, or Non-Like Acts by Richard Peels. Some of the questions that I steal from those books, especially Peels, is like, we tend to analyze, or at the beginning of this kind of new historiographical age, we tend to think on Cold War influence as this big power projecting and try to making a homogenization of their country that received that influence. But in reality, as Peter said, European accepted part of that American influence, but negotiated, rejected, or make their own hybrid product with this influence. The same applies with the second quotation, European reluctant to admit US superiority. Again, where I said before, there was this kind of big superiority in military or economic realms. As a result, Europeans tend to look to the other side of the Atlantic with this superiority complex. Yes, they have the better equipment, better armies, but we have still better high culture. That stereotype was vivid, was important, and very ubiquitous in the 50s and 60s. So after this kind of brief historiographical analysis of the evolution these 20 years or so, I will present also very briefly some of these two books chapter that I have the privilege to co-edit with Lorenzo Delgado and Benedetta Galandra. And also I have the privilege of working with up to 10 different scholars from different countries. So if I can say something about my own book or this edited book is that unlike previous book, it's an American colleague that crafted very interesting book, but they have mainly or only American perspective from American sources. In these two books, we strive to present a kind of more global understanding of the Cold War, including Italian sources, French sources, American sources, Latin American sources, of course. So this is the first book that I would like to talk about. I'm not going to enter in all the chapter, but I'm glad if you see some of the titles that attract you or you are interested. Of course, at the end we can discuss. Very also briefly about my own chapter, like the conclusion chapter of this volume. I title Perception and Misperception in Inter-American Relations. Why so? Because my hypothesis that many of the narratives were biased by those stereotypes, and also a kind of families of, again, this is kind of more complex, but the summary is like during the 40s and 50s, Washington struck to promote, for instance, Pan-Americanism. That Pan-Americanism main obstacle or pitfall was the perception among many Latin American leaders and Latin American writer, philosopher, that they did not belong to America, like Washington America. They belonged to other cultural ties, cultural roots. And there were therefore this kind of Latinos or Latin American fellows versus Pan-American or American, US American fellows. And because this was neglected in previous narrative of the Cold War, I wanted to basically go deeper on that topic. Later on in other slide, I will come back to that issue. This is the second book, and basically the first one I presented and these are, in a way, they are complementary to each other. Why so? Because of course we couldn't cover all the possible case studies, all the possible angles, all the possible perspective. So that's why the first one and the second one are like kind of complementary to each other. And needless to say, we have not answered all the questions. Indeed, now we are working, or I'm working, a kind of a third book, which could be a continuation of these first two volumes. At the end, I will be glad to answer your question about my new project, but I don't want to now take more time. Being frank with you, And now, like 5 years after I started with this 2 book project, I would say that now I know some issues, I know some statistics, some angles, but I confess with you that I ignore a lot of questions, a lot of details of cases, because Latin America is so complex. Each country has their specific circumstances that it would be, I mean, I would not say that I now know the whole picture, the whole scenario. That's why precisely I want to talk with you and learn from your perspective, your insight, or your criticism. This slide is it's a kind of purpose for this third project book of the following book. In this 2.1, we had a kind of more mainly historical or either political science perspective. And in the following one, I would like to have a kind of more multidisciplinary approach. I know this is a kind of challenge, but that's why I want to talk about this. And indeed, I'm trying to learn or take some ideas from this classic Eric Fromm, Escape from Freedom, or Benedict Anderson, The Magic Communities, or Banana Nationalism. These 3 books are now in my mind, in my head, in my imagination, every time I look to those historical questions or historical cases. I wouldn't say that before we ignored them, but now I want to integrate better this perspective in order to have a kind of more global, multidisciplinary approach, together with other famous books from other realms. And another question I want to pose here, and it's an answer question. If you look to any, well, mainly European guidebook for understanding or learning the Cold War, the starting point is 47. Yes, of course. Well, there are some authors that started to doubt if, at least for Latin America, we should start in a different period. That's what I did. Because I think 47 is good starting point for Europe, mainly for Europe. But in Latin America, there were other cultural and ideological contexts that started precisely at the end of 19th century. So that timeline that served for European context perhaps should be rethink or revisited if we want to have a better understanding of Latin American Cold War. Well, to make the long story short, and because I want to have this kind of longue durée perspective, I would not start in 47, but end of 19th century. During this first quarter of the 20th century, of course, there was this kind of US hard power implementation, policy, aggressive military, inspire or at least influence coup d'etat that we cannot understand without US presence, influence, and sometimes direct action. But again, we want to go beyond this military perspective or narrative. Why so? Most of the books that were published in the late 19th century, late 20th century, precisely analyze this military perspective. But there are these other layers, these other cultural and ideological layers. These cartoons, these memes, help to understand kind of the basic understanding of the US present, US Cold War. Yes, it's true that many Latin American officers, they were trained in US School of the Americas fortress, but it could be unfair to say that it was only US responsibility. Why so? Because many Latin American officers, soldiers, and high rank commanders, they wanted to have that training and they asked for that US influence. In other words, and this is a very famous Norwegian historian analyzing Western Europe after World War II, empire by invitation is the concept that this Norwegian professor coin, and I think that empire by invitations also apply to Latin America. We shouldn't again neglect and forget that there were many Latin American dictators that were claiming that Washington present. It was not only Washington direct influence, but kind of depending on the cases, more complex perspective. Well, now trying to summarize the whole timeline. Of course, I'm not going to detain now, stop in all the details, but to make the long story short, from the early 20th century up to 1938, that's the year to remember, 1938, in that 30 years area or space, Washington, believe it or not, was reluctantly in the field of public diplomacy. Why so? Because private initiative by foundation, American foundation, were leading the process. It's not that Washington didn't want to think about, it was like, well, we better, because we are a kind of private-oriented society, we let the foundation to lead the process. 1938 was the turning point. Why so? You can guess. Spanish Civil War, almost the beginning of World War II, and German propaganda, together with Franco propaganda, was deployed in Latin America. And that's why, precisely in 1938, was the first year in which Washington government created a branch for cultural diplomacy, public diplomacy, propaganda, the word we can talk later on, which applies better. So 38 is the starting point for this Washington closely direct cultural diplomacy or public diplomacy or propaganda. Before, mainly it was in hand of American foundation. Well, this part with this famous Roosevelt and Brazilian president picture. World War II, I'm trying to make this quick so we have more time for question and answer. World War II, especially in the Americas, was not as important as in Europe because the conflict mainly took place in this side of the Atlantic, right? But Latin America, or many Latin American countries, help Washington strategy, provide with soldiers, and that is important to bear in mind, because precisely from 46 and 47, we will see later on some slide, some Latin American leaders, politicians, thought that Washington used them during World War II and now forget about their priorities or their interest. Because Washington's obsession, if I might say, was in Central Europe, in Western Europe, because the menace of another conflict in that area, in that scenario. So 1938, as I said, the first moment in which Washington tried to control all realms or channels to convey cultural diplomacy, cultural propaganda. Radio was vital. Radio was one of the main assets. And it was not by coincidence that in 1942, Voice of America was launched. There was no such a capabilities in the United States until 42. Why so? Yes, Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, December 41. So Voice of America was created precisely in this time of tension, in this time of war, because it was understood that we needed American thought. We needed to also persuade the people of the world of our goals, of our story. It's our story that should be prevalent among audiences across the world. This is a case of this where I said before, Spanish, Franco Spain, and Germany during the Hitler power during that season alliance in Latin America. Why so? To make the long story short, because Franco victory cannot be understood without German and Italian help, right? So as a kind of to pay back that help, German propaganda was deployed through Spanish channels like radio, but also like press, like Spanish houses in different Latin American countries. So that was a kind of win-to-win strategy. And that, again, is precisely why 1938, I repeat, Washington started to perceive this kind of Spanish-German alliance with fear, with kind of alarm. Not only radio, press, but also cartoons. Cartoons were very important asset in this period. But if you can read in this title, it's a famous classic book, 1975, How to Read Donald Duck. That was one of the first book, and in my opinion, from my point of view, of course, it's interesting, but it presented two, from my 2024 understanding, I think, kind of simplistic understanding of the Cold War, because mainly what these two authors, Dorman and Mattelar, argue is that if you read Donald Duck, then you will become Americanized. And again, reality is more complex than these black and white narratives. But we can come back later on to discuss. I like this cartoon because this offers another perspective, another angle, which is how, and I don't know if there is some Argentinian in the floor or some Argentinian listening to this conversation. I have many Argentinian friends, so I talk with them about this. Argentina suffered a kind of nostalgic feeling of losing terrain, losing momentum against Washington. Why so? Because Argentina, from the end of 19th century and early 20th century, Argentina wanted to play the role of the leader of the Americas. And of course, that was the role that Washington was playing, especially after World War II. So perhaps the most intense anti-American feelings in all of Latin America are from Argentina, for other reasons that I will unveil later on. This is another kind of realm for future studies. I don't know if any of you want to develop PhD dissertation. There are many cases still to be properly studied. This is a list, it's not complete, but a list that I come across with in the archive of the binational cultural center created in many different Latin American countries. Each of them could serve for a PhD dissertation, which I don't know yet all the details, but just for you to understand that we still don't know many details, many case studies. Well, important to underline, they were binational in their bylaw precisely to avoid the perception of cultural imperialism. It was not coincident that they were Instituto Cultural Brasileiro Norteamericano, Instituto Cultural Chileno Norteamericano. That was purposely organized from US diplomats that didn't want the perception that, oh, this is a part of the Tio San, Uncle San cultural imperialism in our society. That's why it was binational. American houses, still there are not many books, as far as I know, analyzing the importance of American houses in different Latin American countries. By the way, now we are in Germany, I'm in Germany, there are important literature about the role of American houses in Germany, because Germany was the country in all over Europe that had more American houses, more American cultural centers than any other case. Book exhibition targeting children. Indeed, this was the cover. I used this picture because I love it. It was the cover for my first book. I don't know if you can read, but say, make friends with books. And no, by coincidence, again, the target group, one of the main target group was children, because they were understood as the leaders or the men and women of the future. So there were many book exhibition precisely targeting kids, children. Not only like literature, books, but also trade fairs, cartoons, and important, the promotion of US know-how or no transfer, how transfer. Why so? Because the idea was to present the US hegemony or superiority was not only in military or economic terms, but also in science, in chemistry, in different fields. Now, if we look again to Latin America in comparison with Western Europe, you see in this graphic why, what I said before, why some Latin American leader thought that they had been betrayed by Washington. Because if you look to the 40s, the money invested in Latin America was superior to the money invested in Western Europe. From 51 through 41 through 45, the number of grantees, Latin American grantees, exchange diplomacy, was, as you can see, much higher in Latin American countries. Why so? Because there was this fear of ideological penetration, ideological propaganda, either from fascists or other totalitarian regimes in Latin America. That is the breakdown by countries. And again, it's not by surprise that Brazil and Argentina were the countries that received more grantees, more money in so-called exchange diplomacy. I put to the right the book by Lippenbu, Making the World Like Us, and another possible PhD is the continuation of these studies in Latin America, because as far as I know, there is very little small literature about this topic. Foreign leader program, another avenue, another research possible avenue. The book here, Network of Empire, is by my colleague Giles Scott. We have collaborated in several occasions. He published a couple of book chapters in other books I coordinated. This is a very good book, probably a masterpiece book. And Giles analyzed France, Great Britain, and Holland, this foreign leader program. As far as I know, there is no such a study for any Latin American cases. So it's another interesting research avenue. Book programs, 57. If you look here, you might say, well, a lot of money, like $4 million invested in programs, in book programs to deploy these US goals, US geopolitical goals. But if you compare with Europe or with the rest of the world, the Latin American breakdown of the money invested only was 9%. If you compare Europe, Europe received 50% of the whole budget in this so-called book diplomacy. So those Latin American leaders or Latin American philosopher or writer that were kind of angry with Washington, or they thought that they had been betrayed, they were right, because they were receiving much less attention and funds and invest than other countries across the world. Alliance for Progress, and the construction, the building process of schools across Latin America. And this is, in this case, is a Chilean school created not by coincidence after the earthquake in 1960. Daniel talked to me about this book, Spanish Diplomacy in the Case of Peru, 1950 earthquake. In this case is American help American influence, American diplomacy to help Chile after the earthquake in 1960. Another realm, another research avenue for a perhaps 4 or 5 book or another PhD dissertation. All those are journals, periodicals, promoted and paid by U.S. diplomacy money. There are few articles here and there, but there are not in-depth analysis of these articles and journals and how they were distributed either in Europe or in Latin America, the reaction and the interaction, who were the European or Latin American writers writing in those journals and those platforms. Again, there is very little literature. And in this other slide, I want to analyze the different so-called narrative, right? Well, as you say, as you can see, one of the main topic for discussion was racial issues. Why so? Because U.S. Government strove to promote the idea that, of course, that was kind of rosy story. In the 50s, Noticias de la Autoridad 54, not by coincidence, the cover is by this Afro-American that has been appointed as important diplomat. Which was the message to be conveyed? There was no more racial problem in the United States. That was 10 years before Martin Luther King movement. So it was again a kind of rush story because reality was not as good as this American journal strove to promote, strove to present. Precisely because Soviet diplomats knew that, they emphasized those contradictions with this, for instance, poster of New York skyline and the crimes or assassination of Afro-Americans. Or another important turning point, Patrice Lumumba was assassinated in 1962. Not by coincidence, in Moscow, there was a recently created university, and few months after Patrice Lumumba assassination, that was the name given to this new university, the Patrice Lumumba University. The Patrice Lumumba. I think the subtitle was the culture of the world university, of the people of the world university, trying to present the message that we do care more about other culture than these American that they have mistreating their Afro-American in the South, which was true, right? So that's why I say this kind of context of narrative, who is presenting the most accurate narrative. Was another poster about this clashing narrative, the Rossi story narrative that, well, everything now is crystal clear, no problems in our society, no racial discrimination. Not only that, but also through the Peace Corps or the Island of Progress, we are helping these Latin American countries to find their development, their own path to reach society, to economic progress. Another possible research avenue, people like Feltrinelli, I call him mediators. Very important Italian publisher and Italian, I would say even tycoon, powerful. And he was very close to Castro. He was very interested for the development of the Cuban Revolution, the agrarian reform in Latin America. So together, that's why I put in this kind of graph, because he's kind of a crossroad of different interests and different goals and different strategies, but he was the man. He was the important leader of this kind of cultural transfer from, in this case, Latin America to Italy, and from Italy to other European countries. But at the same time, he partook in some program funded by the Ford Foundation. But at the same time, he was very close to the PC, the Partito Comunista Italiano. So with this, I think it's probably the best example that we shouldn't have this black and white narrative because it's more complex. Reality is full of details, nuances, and Feltrinelli deserves a book or two books at least, or a PhD dissertation, because it's impossible to summarize his career in just a few sentences, right? This is part of this Feltrinelli effect in Europe, because he published this Lettere Cubana in Italian and also translated in French. I don't know if it was translated also in German. I was a very important platform for the so-called new European left. So we can understand the evolution of the so-called new European left without the role of Feltrinelli and how he served as a kind of bridge in between the two sides of the Atlantic. Another potential research avenues that I think we should reconsider. My colleague, well, he has written a book chapter in another book that I'm now editing and talking about Ranan Renin. And he has this book, which I love, Migrant Refugees and Asylum Seekers in Latin America. But revisiting the topic, I thought about these other classic non-like acts by Roger Daniels. Why these two books, I think, could be complementary to each other, or also complementary to this so-called Cold War, cultural Cold War narrative, because there are many layers, again, in this topic that has not been deeply developed. In other words, I'm trying to say that this magnificent book could be complemented, could serve as a starting point for further research on the Cold War migration studies. The same applies to labor study. I wrote a couple of articles about US labor unions and Spanish anti-Franco labor unions, but I still miss the Latin American part. I talked to Daniel about this yesterday. For instance, the role of Serafino Romualdi. Serafino Romualdi, I don't know if this rings a bell, or American Federation of Labor leader George Manning. Labor diplomacy studied, that is important field and has tons of books, has not been, in my view, properly integrated in this cultural Cold War narrative or study. There are few articles here and there, few studies, but we still don't know many details. For instance, the so-called American Institute for Free Labor Development, that on the picture. Well, the perception, the stereotype in Latin America was that, well, this is part of the CIA. It's no more than CIA puppet. Perhaps CIA knew about that, of course. Perhaps CIA was funding, but I think it's unfair to say that this was just a puppet. Why so? At least where I know for this Spanish case, because sometimes local labor union leaders had their own agendas that sometimes clash with the Washington agenda. Again, in the Spanish case that I studied, for instance, George Manning, American Federation of Labor, very powerful confederation of union. George Manning was from Irish Catholic upbringing. He was kind of conservative, even for labor union standard. He every time rejected Franco diplomat attempt to engage with him. He was totally, in his action, anti-Franco. So it's kind of, well, this doesn't match with my hypothesis or we match with my stereotype, because if he's conservative Catholic, we should consider, or we could think, well, perhaps then he held Franco. It was the opposite, at least in this Spanish case. So that prevent, I would say, this black and white narrative. We have to go to the sources and to see the details, see the nuances. The labor field is almost unexplored in Latin America, different cases, different countries. Literature and underdevelopment is another realm that deserve further studies. Or what I said before, the so-called music diplomacy. We know more studies, more articles about music diplomacy in Western Europe. This is a quotation that I come across with in the archive in Washington, which I think is kind of very telling. I'm not going to read everything, but that was the most general understanding of jazz music, not only in Germany. This is a sample from Germany because we are in Germany, but I had tons of examples very similar from France, Spain, Italy. The same prejudice. This is not our classic music. This is Afro-American music. This is nigger music. That was constantly the answer in survey that US diplomat had in Western Europe. Not to make the spoiler of this movie, if you haven't watched it, the Sweden Kids, very interesting book, movie, understanding and analyzing this back and forth, this like so-called audio ammo effect that some European young kids love America, but some other reject it. So this back and forth. I'm not going to make the spoiler. This is about precisely, that's why I put it here, Germany in the 30s and how American jazz, American rhythms were perceived, were accepted in Germany. To finally conclude, well, a few more slides. The specific topic of development and how there was also a context in between Americans and Soviet too. I think there is another lecture, right, about this later on in the series. So I'm not going to talk a lot, but here you see some of these Feltrinelli promoted or Feltrinelli funded outlets, publication, in which the topic of development was discussed. In this case, of course, it's a kind of clearly open anti-American narrative, because Uncle Sam was perceived as this guy that is theoretically helping Latin American country, but in fact stealing the resources or not being fair, not offering a truly win-to-win strategy. Oops. I love this quotation, attributed to Einstein. It is easier to disintegrate an atom than to disintegrate a prejudice. That I use as a kind of narrative for my own research. The chapter I say before, perception and misperception in inter-American relation. Why so? What I say at the beginning. While Washington from the early 20th century was trying to promote Pan-Americanism, to have the ideological leadership of the Americas, at the same time, the Latinos or many Latino leaders didn't like that and created a kind of a group of Latinos versus Pan-American strategies or goals. And the roots and the beginning, the starting point are these end of 19th century cartoons. Ironically enough, the Spanish North American war in Cuba in 1898 that helped US to gain momentum and to control that country, and for Spain was a kind of national tragedy. I say, ironically enough, that was the starting point of this Latinos cultural approach to oppose the Pan American attempt to control Latin American society, not only militarily, but with this cultural program. So again, 1898 war in Cuba was like the beginning of this pro-Latinos, pro-Hispanos group or realms or societies, as we will see. It's not a surprise that Rubén Darío wrote El Triunfo de Caliban in this early 20th century. Neither that Rodó wrote Ariel in the beginning of 20th century. So what I did in this new project is trace down the influence of Rodó in Castro. Believe it or not, you will see some samples later on, or in other Latin American leaders, because they needed to justify their cultural hegemony against Washington purpose Pan-American hegemony. So Ariel was probably the most influenced and more vital asset for that Latinos community against Pan American. Here a kind of graphic example of what I say. Rodó being the center of this common feedback and brainstorming and mutual cross-fertilization from Martí to Rubén Darío, Castro Vasconcelo, Sandino, or Argentina Manuel Baldomero Ugarte. I have no time now to offer all the details of those cross-fertilization. That is the forthcoming book project that I have now crafting. But I was surprised, especially in Castro or in even the Che Guevara, how in some of their speeches, how they talk about Ariel and how Ariel was so important, so influential. This is a kind of joke I have with my Argentinian friends. I don't know if you have ever wondered why there are so many Ariels as a name in Argentina. So this is the hypothesis, ironic hypothesis I had, I say with them, that perhaps it's not a coincidence that Ariel is probably one of the most common name in Argentina. Well, that's it. Now I'm very glad to answer questions, comments, criticism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rodriguez. It was a very interesting, very insightful conference. Thank you for your invitations for reading all this interesting bibliography. From my side, most of them are new in terms of understanding the cultural wars in Latin America. And of course, thank you for all these proposals for research avenues. This is interesting. Is very stimulated for the students, for people that are hearing us, to receive this input from someone that knows so well this field. Yes, I would like to open the floor for the space for receive your comments, questions. Let me say hello to Molly Geidel. She's there, she's connected. She will be also a speaker in our winter lecture series. It's nice to know that you are here, Molly. Thank you for your presence. So please, we collect some questions in the chat. Is open, of course, in the room. You can raise your hands, and there in Bogota, you can Andres collect the questions. So please, I have of course some questions, but let's gather from you comments and questions. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. They are just shy.
The first one is the most difficult one.
Yeah, this is Please.
Question is, why the number of exchange students was so much higher? And why there was this big difference from the European and the Latino exchange students?
Well, in this graphic, I presented the 41 through 47, 48 timeline. The explanation behind that difference is because, as I say, in the early 30s, both Franco-German and Italian propaganda started to be deployed in Latin American countries. As a result, Washington was afraid of being penetrated ideologically from this Latin American neighboring country, precisely to avoid that influence. Many exchange diplomacy programs were put into place in order to attract Latin American leaders, to avoid them to become pro-Germany or pro-Italy or pro-Franco Spain. That was intensively implemented during World War II. After World War II ended, to make the long story short, Washington said, well, we don't have that fear, that risk anymore. And the priority now we're in Central Europe, we're in Germany, we're in France, we're in Great Britain. So that's why you see a sea of money from Latin America to Europe. And that's why many Latin American writers, philosophers were angry or kind of sad or kind of thought, well, US now has betrayed us because we were supporting them during the war and now they forgot about us. So that is the explanation behind that.
Okay, we have one question here in Zoom, one question here in the room. We hear these two questions. Andres, let me know you have questions there. But we're gonna hear first Nicolas Tokica. He is connected in Zoom. Please, Nicolas.
Yes, hello. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. Yes, I'm sorry if I did not pay like attention to slightly my last spoken. But like you were talking earlier, like this fear of US like the idea of Latin American countries like it's like you
Nicolas, we are not hearing well. Could you maybe you can make the question in Spanish also? It's not because you're English, it's because of the
audio.
Or perhaps in the
Yes.
chat.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to do it in the chat. It's like
I don't mind because the quality of the sound is very unheavenly is bad.
is it like better or should I like fix the chats?
Yeah, please write your question in the chat if you don't mind.
Yes, thank you, Nicolas. Yeah.
Yeah, no, sorry.
No. Okay, so while he's writing, so here we have a question from you. And no, no.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Francisco. It was very inspiring lecture. I was wondering about the European agendas in this cultural struggle, perhaps because Latin American historiography or can be a misunderstanding, but it's not so usual to read or know the European actors talking about bridges and mediators beyond these two main parts of the cultural world, USSR and the States. But we have also seen emerging, as you present, emerging studies that emphasize the Latin Americans' connection with Europe, for instance, the Czech, Hungarians, France, and its ambitions to once again become a cultural and intellectual power. So, what's the place in the historiographical discussion about this European? Are the same agendas or different? The reasons to being involved in the struggle. And the second question regarding the upcoming books that you mentioned before. Are you with your colleagues looking to integrate more cases to cover some periods or to address questions that remain unanswered the initial volumes that you already published?
There is one question more, and maybe it's better to have more questions. Maybe you can connect your reply, your response. So from the director of the SILAS, Miriam, please, we can hear you.
Yes, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. Well, I would be interested in the reactions from Latin America to that US cultural diplomacy. Could you maybe give some examples? Yeah, and the second thing is I find your project about the influence of Ariel de Rodó very interesting, because what is much more known is Caliban by Fernández Retamar. So yeah, I think it's surprising to see that Ariel has maybe had even more influence on the pensamiento of the Cuban Revolution than Caliban, Shakespeare's other prominent figure.
Okay, great. So we have enough questions. You can read the questions from Nicolas if you.
Okay.
Awesome.
So Nicolas Tokica wrote, you said something before about US government being afraid of Latin countries shifting towards fascist and communist tendency before World War II. What were the specific way in which these political ideas could have gotten to the region to the point of the triggering threat from the US? Okay.
So enough material.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you very much to all of you for these interesting questions. Some of them kind of difficult to answer briefly, but I'll try. Starting with Daniel. Yes, there are many specificity ins and out from basically each European country. For instance, I can talk about Spain, but also because I was in Lisbon, there are also some Portuguese case study very interesting to understanding the whole picture. Or I'm less knowledgeable about German cases, but for instance, I don't want to be wrong, I think 58, German government signed an agreement with Portugal to create a military base in Beja that was kind of part of the Cold War. So again, Germany, Western Germany, wanted to have kind of access to this part of the war because it was part of the geopolitical preparation or geopolitical planification. Another example that I know better, the Spanish case of Franco diplomacy in the United States. Franco diplomacy in the United States strove to promote the idea, especially from 51 onwards, that Franco was not a fascist dictator anymore. That was the most important goal of Spanish diplomacy to be deployed in Washington. We don't want to be perceived, Franco thought, as a dictator anymore. We are an authoritarian government, but guess what? We are Catholic. So Catholicism was underlined as the message to be deployed in US newspaper, radio, and even cinema, because it was the way to clean up Franco image among US public opinion. There are many other cases, like one in the book chapter in the Siles edited book, Francois, that analyzed the French public diplomacy in Mexico in the 70s as a way to promote French grandeur. So the French government thought that they needed to invest more in Mexico, not by considering Mexico, because, well, the historical ties in between French foreign policy and Mexico. So that was a kind of revival of that French interest in Mexico. That was during the 70s. So French government offered to the Mexican government help with French know-how transfer for Mexican different factories and technologies to be imported from France. So that is another example. There are many examples. Italy, as I say. As for the question of Ariel and how popular was Ariel versus others authors, my expertise is not literature, so perhaps you are more knowledgeable than me, but I was puzzled by the number of time in which Ariel was quoted either in Castro speeches or in Che Guevara speeches and many other Latin American leaders. So I don't know which one was the most influential, but I was again surprised by the power, the influence of Ariel. And also that applies to what I said before. Argentinian anti-use feelings were at least until the 60s or even 70s, probably the most important in Latin America. And Ariel, although Ariel was from Uruguay, Rodó was from Uruguay, Ariel was accepted as an Argentinian leader, ideological leader, because also if you look to Argentinian politicians, Ariel is constantly quoted. Ariel is constantly praised as the leader of this Latinos movement against US imperialism. So again, this is an ongoing project. So perhaps in a few months I will have more details to share with you. But now what I say is that Ariel is everywhere in Castro, Che Guevara, and Argentinian philosophers and political leaders. So that's why I mentioned that this kind of glue cultural reference in order to put together all different Latin America leaders against Washington understood imperialistic attempt to promote Pan-Americanism against Latinos or Hispanos specificities. And then as for the Nicolas question, I'm going to read it again. Well, there were many ways in which those political ideas were already being promoted in not only Latin America, but also in United States territory. Labor unions, student unions, philosopher, writers. So the presence, the influence of those pro-totalitarian ideas were deployed through many different channels. Perhaps the students' organization were, if not the main, the first realm in which this influence was deployed. Actually, coming back to the idea that we should revisit the timeline, the 47 timeline, in, I think, 1917, at the same time that the Russian Revolution took place, in Cordoba, in Argentina, there was this very important students' revolution, a student riot, that was vital for other Latin American countries' labor students' movement association. So that is an example of this ideological context that I think we should not start in 47, but before, at least 1917, 1918, because there were many of these events that affected to other Latin American countries. So that is precisely what I'm now doing, to see those connections, not in 47, but before.
Okay, we have one question here, one question in Zoom, and 2 questions in Bogota. So let us start with the questions here. Please.
Okay. As I know some South American countries and also Central American countries, in my perception is that the Central American countries in general are more influenced by the US diplomacy, whereas the southern countries like Brazil, Chile, Argentina have much more influence from European country, and I think there is some kind of own identity in this sense, more than in the Central American countries. I'm not sure if it's if I'm right or it's only prejudice to say that what says the Albert Einstein.
Let us hear the question.
Okay, sure.
Yes, it's better maybe.
Sure.
So, Randa, nice to see you here.
Hi, hello everyone. Hello Luis and hello Andres. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to ask Francisco, so what do you think about the CIA as a historical concept? Today we know that the CIA is an institution that was not innocent during the Cold War. But so that does the CIA have the same concept today as at the beginning of the Cold War? And yes, how do you think about the concept has changed? Yeah, this is my question.
Yeah, thank you for this.
Thank you.
Specific question, concrete question.
Okay.
So,
should I answer now?
Prefer to answer or?
Yeah.
okay.
So, very interesting question. That we would need another conference to analyze the difference in between Central America and well, southern part of Latin America. Yes and no, in the sense that first, a factor to analyze Washington versus each Latin American country or each Central American country is the size and the power, because the asymmetry, of course, affect. If we look to, let's say, another European country, Estonian, with all my respect for Estonian, that I have also Estonian friends, Estonian culture influence in US is much less than American influence in Estonia, right? So the same applies to, let's say, Santo Domingo or any other Central American country, that because the asymmetry of power, the size is so different, it's very difficult to avoid that kind of very ubiquitous US culture, because it's everywhere. But I say no because at the same time you have Cuba, which is like this, is like the exception to the rule, or you have Nicaragua where you have Sandinistas. So it's yes and no. First factor is size, vicinity to the big superpower, because also Mexico is another case study that is difficult to summarize, because Mexico is at the same time Mexican attitude towards US has been during the 20th century critical. Probably one of the most anti-US feelings were in Mexico. But then when you look to Mexican foreign policy, most of the time is more pro-Washington than you could have perceived or thought. So it's kind of contradiction, right? Because Mexican society, when they are analyzed, their attitude, they are very anti-American. But then the Mexican government, most of the time, were more inclined to follow Washington foreign policy consensus that go against it. So, and in the bigger countries, example, Brazil or Argentina, each of them deserve a specific case study, right? Or also look into which period. My interest, as I said before, is Argentina, because from early 20th century up to the World War II, Argentina wanted to play that role of leader of the Americas. And precisely because then they could not play that role anymore, there was this kind of cultural contest. Well, we cannot compete in economy or military equipment, but we still have our culture, our tango, our soccer that is better than the Americans, right? So it's this kind of back and forth context in the different realms. As for Randall, CIA, where I study specifically about CIA is labor union or labor diplomacy and the Spanish case. So I only can talk from the Spanish case with details. And what I can say is that Spanish anti-Franco labor leaders, they saw CIA initiative, CIA hands everywhere. And they were right sometimes, but sometimes they were not. Why so? Because, well, of course, they were ideologicalized, they were very leftist, if I may say. So they assumed that Washington, CIA, and American Federation of Labor, George Many, were always working together, always were, cooperating to have this plot. And as I say, which is kind of hard to believe, but that's what I found in the archive and that's what I published. American Federation of Labor leader, George Many, that again was Catholic, Irish, very conservative for European standard, but in reality, he was very anti-Franco. So that break the hypothesis that FLCO, CIA, and US Embassy were working together. They had some agendas together, yes, but sometimes they had very opposite agendas and goals. So that, in order to answer a random question, that the CIA during the 50s and 60s was many times perceived as more powerful than they were. They were perceived as this super well lubricated machinery. Sometimes they were not well lubricated machinery, and they committed many mistakes, and they had less fun than they thought, and the people thought that they had. So it's more, as I say, nuanced story, and it would be unfair to generalize. We have to look to each case divided and specifically if we want to offer accurate narrative, accurate answer.
So thank you. Andres, please.
Okay, thank you, Luis, and thank you, Francisco. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So we have several questions, but we're going to try to be as brief as possible. So please, who would like to start? You have to face the camera. No, okay.
Good afternoon, sir. Can you hear me well? Okay, so, good afternoon. Can you hear me well? Yes, I think that you.
Yes, we can hear.
At the beginning of the conference, you talked about the influence of the Cold War around the world. Specifically, you mentioned the tension between other countries that are part of the First and the Second World. Other thing that was very interesting for me was the part of the other thing was the part when you remember us, the importance of humanities in this historical process. Taking into account those topics, how the competence between America and Soviet Union started to generate other Cold Wars into other First World countries. Why doesn't it happen between Latin American nations according to humanity?
I'm not sure that we got the point.
I just wrote Andres to write.
Yeah, we're going to write them down in the chat.
Yes,
Okay,
please.
yes, please.
We're going to try with the second one. Otherwise, if it doesn't work, so we'll have to switch to chat. So one question.
Just speak slow and
Slowly and loud. Loud and.
Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. So according considering that Spain's political situation during Franco's regime and the characterization of the third world countries during the Cold War, my question is, could it be said that Spain was a third world country? And if the answer is yes, so how and when do you think this status changed? And how is this relate to the success or failure of the North American cultural soft power?
okay.
And thank you very much.
Andres,
Yes.
very good question. I would need an hour only to answer to that.
Yes.
I'm gonna try to summarize with the highlights.
Do you want to hear all the questions from there? Maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
With that, I will an hour to answer.
Elias and David. Okay, can you hear me right?
Well, my question is related to the reactions or responses that may happen in Latin America to this cultural imperialism. Like, to be more specific about it, because you only mentioned like the Argentinian one, that was more like a competition. But I want to know about these reactions or responses that if you could give answer to this cultural imperialism that could act as national discourses or reivindications of these countries or people in these countries.
It's difficult to, when you speak so fast, it's difficult to understand, to get the point. Just please be more concrete and speak slowly.
Maybe unmute the microphone here. Can you hear me better? It's better now? My question is more related to the reactions and responses that may happen in Latin America to this cultural imperialism. Like this, there were like reactions or answers to that cultural imperialism that could act as national discourses or reivindications in these countries.
Was it better?
Was that better for you? I didn't.
I don't know if I got it well, but I try. You were trying to convey the question if the different reaction to this so-called or perceived U.S. cultural imperialism, right? And how that was integrated in national discourses, if I understood well.
Excellent. Yeah.
Okay.
It's not a question about your English, it's a question about the acoustic of the place and maybe the technical, yeah, the acoustic also here. And also the speed of the speaking.
Mhm. Okay, the first question, as I say, is a very good one. It's a long one to be answered, but starting in 53, September 53, US government and Franco signed an agreement. That agreement, 53, September 53, was the beginning of the chain of Spanish isolationism and Spanish autarky and economic backward. 53 was the beginning of this US-Franco relation, political relation, and precisely in that year, the economic programs in the Spanish government started to be influenced by US pro-capitalist approach. Before 53, Spanish Minister of Economy, his name was Suárez, had the dream, because it was a dream, to have this autarky, meaning that Spain could live without any external input, any investment, any import. That was a dream, I say, because Spain was about to collapse economically until 53. 55, Spain entering in the United Nations, and then 57, there was a big economic program to improve Spanish economy that was about to collapse. In the 60s, Spain started to grow. The economy of Spain, together with Japan, had a rate of up to 10% of GDP each year. If you look to that figure from our current perspective, in which like 2%, 3% is already a very big figure, in that early 70s, Spain, together with Japan, were growing to up some years to 10% of the GDP, which is a kind of miracle in terms of economy. Of course, there are more factors than only the American influence, but American influence was important. Another factor, and actually related with Germany, is the millions of Spaniards that started to immigrate to Germany, Switzerland, France. Why so? Because then they save money and they send money to their families in Spain. Together with another factor, tourism. Spain started to receive millions of Europeans visitors. That, of course, was another important economic asset. So these three factors combined could explain why Spain, the 60s, started to be a middle class incomes country equivalent, not yet totally, but closer to other European countries. And to your other point of how Spain was perceived, it was perceived as a third world country in the late 40s, in the 40s, in the 50s, in some international analysis, yes, Spain was included in the group of third world country, but in the 60s, that situation changed, as I was trying to explain. As for the other question of cultural imperialism and national discourses or national responses, one of the most telling example, again, is Argentina. Why so? During the 60s, the Alliance for Progress, deployed during the Kennedy administration, Argentina received quite a lot of money through this alliance. But if you look to the political discourses in Argentinian political spectrum, that American money deployed through the Alliance of Progress most of the time served for national dispute. In other words, that international or American programs were not openly received or openly welcome, because that was part of the internal dispute in between the different Argentina groups. So again, that's why I think each case should be understood, should be analyzed specifically. I don't know the Colombian case, but my understanding is that in Colombia was different, and I tend to think, I don't know, you might disagree with me, that Colombian politicians were most of the time more on the Washington page than Argentinian, at least. They were more, Argentinians were more critical of Washington in general than Colombians or even Chilean until Allende.
So we have some questions in the chat. We're almost about finishing. So we have around 13 minutes before finish. So it's better if you read the questions. It's better for you understand the question.
Sure.
This first question is
It is possible the influence the United States had in Latin America played a role in the construction of Latino identity. As I say, there was this kind of contest in between pro-Washington Pan-American identity versus Latinos or Hispanos identity. There was this kind of competition, and yes, it was a response against that pro-Washington Pan-Americanism that many Latin American philosopher writer didn't like, and precisely because of that, they wanted to create an alternative to that pro-Washington Pan-Americanism. And then I think I read something about a possible Cold War .2 led by China. I read that too in other scenarios and in the podcast. My answer is that the geopolitical context nowadays is very different. First, China now, as far as I know, is not trying to promote a different economic model, right? Is pure capitalistic model, yes, with a different political law, different political identity, different cultural, but they don't contest the economic model, which is capitalism. During Cold War, there was, yes, a different alternative non-capitalist model. So that's the first question that should prevent us to say, yes, this is the new Cold War. Well, it's a contest, it's a geopolitical battle. I agree, but we shouldn't put the label of Cold War because that's applied to Cold War, not to this new scenario. So that is my answer to this. We could talk more, but I think perhaps other question.
Yeah. Do you have something to say about these questions about at the beginning of your conference? It's not clear for me what the question means, but maybe you.
Sorry, I missed that. I don't know if I understood well the question, but if your point, Andres, is that social science and humanities, their development in either European countries or Latin American countries were affected by this general cultural Cold War, then the answer is yes. Indeed, actually, that is another thing we were discussing. In all these studies, we do miss a more integrated Soviet or Russian perspective. we don't, at least I don't read Russian sources, so that is a kind of pitfall of our analysis, and it's true and it's fair to admit that. But for instance, in the Spanish political science that I know a bit better, the influence of Soviet or communist influence is very visible, is very strong. Also, the labor study that I was describing before, there were many influence from different Soviet space or communist author that were eagerly adopted by Spanish either labor leaders or philosophers. That is our question. We still lack a more complete understanding how that either Soviet or communist or Russian influence were deployed, was channeled, and how this European partner negotiated or not or adapted those influence. That is probably the most unknown part of this story, to be fair. There are a few articles here and there, but still there is a big lacune in that realm. That is probably the most the topic that need more research, to be fair.
Okay.
We know, sorry, just one thing. We know, and that is, I think, a very interesting book I've read lately about some Latin American political leaders or writers that traveled to the Soviet Union and their reaction, their influence, their perception after that trip. That is already studied, but still, as I said, there are much more angles that need to be explored.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Francisco, for your generosity, the generosity with your knowledge, and your constant invitation for researching is very powerful and motivate a lot of us. So I have some questions, but we have no time for that. I think it's time for
I'm glad
closing.
to answer the question.
I just want to say that in all your exposition, I was thinking all the time in my neighborhood in Bogota. I'm from the periphery of Bogota, and I am in a place where the Cold War was very present. And
in which means?
It means that I studied in a communist school and the neighbors were against this installation of the communism, and there was this kind of histories is also shows that the cultural war is not only forming, for example, armies.
Sure.
Or guerrillas is very in many places in Latin America or in the world that is embodied in the everyday.
It's everywhere.
Yeah.
By the way, your comment remind me of another thing that I forgot to say. Well, I cannot talk about everything. The telenovela Barrio. I don't know if you ever heard about Barrio. It was one of the most popular telenovela in the 60s in all over Latin America. That was part of the US public diplomacy. It's not that they wrote all the script, but they helped to promote that telenovela, Nuestro Barrio, because it had a kind of subtle anti-communist message. It was not direct, it was subtle. And because of that they thought, more powerful. Because had I had a very clear anti-communist message, then you could, the audience says, hey, this is promoted by Washington. But because it was subtle anti-Soviet space message, it was more intriguing, and it was promoted as a.
Thank you. So it's time for say thank you for everybody, for your questions, for your participation in this space. We will remind you the next lecture that will be November 6th There will be the rethinking development through South-South lenses, eco-critical approaches from the extractive zone by the Dr. Stefania Murnot from the Austrian Academy of Science. So you're also welcome to join us, Professor Francisco. Nice if you can join us online. She will be also here. Yeah, thank you again, everybody, and I hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you.